There's a silent, stubborn truth in this world, one that whispers from the grimy underbelly of an old engine, hums from the rhythmic stroke of a painter's brush long after the critics have gone home, or echoes in the still air of a garage at 3 in the morning. It's the truth that the real work, the foundational stuff, the very steel of a man's character, isn't forged under the bright, approving glare of an audience. It's hammered out in the dark, in the quiet, in the moments when the world thinks you're doing nothing at all. That's where the grit gets tested, where the unseen effort piles up, piece by agonizing piece, shaping not just the project in your hands, but the man holding the tools. Most folks, they only ever see the finished product, the shiny paint job, the smooth running engine, the confident stride. They never see the lonely nights, the scraped knuckles, the doubt whispered into the darkness. But the man who put in those hours, he knows. He knows the difference. Bo knew that difference, or at least he thought he did. 43 years old, and every one of them seemed etched into the landscape of his hands. They were the kind of hands that told a story without a single word. Knuckles swollen from countless impacts, fingernails perpetually rimmed with a stubborn crescent of engine oil that no amount of scrubbing could fully eradicate, calluses built up like layers of history, each one a monument to a stubborn bolt or a heavy part. He wasn't a small man, not really, but years of leaning over hoods, wrestling with transmissions, and contorting himself into the claustrophobic spaces beneath dashboards had given him a certain stoop, a perpetual readiness to brace, to lift, to pull. His shoulders, wide and solid, carried the quiet weight of physical labor, a daily testament to the brute force required in his trade. He was a mechanic, Bo was, in a shop just off the main drag of a sprawling working-class suburb where the houses were neat but not flashy, and the lawns were mowed but never manicured. He was the kind of mechanic folks brought their rusted-out pickups and their sputtering minivans to when the dealer scratched their head and charged them an arm and a leg just to look. Bo didn't need fancy diagnostic computers to tell you what was wrong half the time. He'd just listen. He'd cup an ear, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow, and the subtle groan of a dying alternator or the telltale whine of a bad wheel bearing would reveal its secret to him. His movements were methodical, deliberate, rarely wasted. Every turn of a wrench, every tug on a wire was performed with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done it 1,000 times before. His face, when it wasn't streaked with grease or sweat, was a roadmap of a life lived more in thought than in talk. Lines fanned out from the corners of his tired eyes, eyes that had seen more failed engines than successful race cars, more broken dreams than restored classics. They were eyes that held a quiet weariness, not of defeat but of perpetual observation, of figuring things out. His jaw was often set, a slight tension that suggested a mind always working, always problem-solving. Bo wasn't loud, wasn't one for small talk beyond the necessary. He was gruff, maybe, to an outsider, but fair. Utterly, reliably fair. If he said it would cost you $300, it would cost you $300, and you knew darn well he'd earned every penny of it. His customers trusted him implicitly. You could set your watch by Bo, and a lot of the older folks in town practically did. He was a fixture, a silent pillar of the community, dependable as the sunrise, even if he rarely caught it himself, preferring the pre-dawn quiet of his own garage. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor to his hands when he wasn't actively engaged in work, a residual vibration from a life spent battling the stubborn resistance of metal. Yet, put a delicate carburetor or a complex circuit board in front of him, and those same hands became instruments of surgical precision, capable of coaxing life back into the dead. He wore his work on him, not just the grease stains on his faded work shirts, but in the slight stoop of his shoulders, the slow, deliberate rhythm of his gait, the way he'd instinctively rub the small of his back after a long day. It wasn't a show, it wasn't a performance. It was just Bo living his life, one wrench turn, one oil change, one engine rebuild at a time, wearing the quiet uniform of a working man. He was solid, reliable, a bedrock of his family and his community, but there was a quiet hum beneath the surface, a barely audible vibration that hinted at something more, something unexpressed, something waiting to be tended to. His world began not with the sunrise, but with the rasp of a digital alarm clock at 4:57 a.m. Always 4:57, not 5:00 that felt too easy, too much like he was cutting corners. 3 minutes early was his own quiet rebellion against the clock, a small victory he won every day before the world even thought about waking up. He'd swing his feet to the worn linoleum, a groan escaping as his knees popped like old machinery, and then stand, stretching the kinks out of a back that knew too many hours hunched over engines. The coffee machine gurgled a sleepy welcome in the kitchen of his modest, ranch-style house. It was a good house, solid. Had seen better days, sure, with paint a shade or two lighter than it once was, and some of the appliances humming on borrowed time. But it was home. Sarah, his wife, a woman who carried her own quiet strength, would usually be up by then, already packing lunches, a hum of some forgotten melody on her lips. They'd share a few murmured words, a solid, comfortable silence mostly, as Beau ate a quick breakfast, usually oatmeal or toast, while flipping through the local paper, not for the news, but for the rhythm of it, the familiar weight in his hands. Lily, his 14-year-old, would soon be clattering downstairs, a whirlwind of teenage energy and art projects, followed by 10-year-old Ethan, still half asleep, dragging his feet like a reluctant anchor. Beau loved those mornings, even the chaotic ones. Loved the smell of Sarah's coffee, the sound of Lily giggling over something on her phone, Ethan's mumbled questions about what was for breakfast. It was the scaffolding of his day, the reason he pulled himself out of bed before the sun had cleared the horizon. By 6:15 a.m., he was in his beat-up pickup truck heading to the shop. The drive was short, a familiar blur of darkened streets and sleepy bungalows. The shop itself was an extension of him, a little worn, a lot functional, smelling of oil, gasoline, and honest work. The big roller door would go up with a protesting screech, and then it was just Beau and the silent waiting machines. He'd start with the invoices, scheduling the day, methodical, precise, his mind already mapping out the repairs, the diagnostic tests, the tricky jobs that needed a deft touch. Hours blurred into a steady rhythm of wrenching, lifting, diagnosing. Grease under his fingernails was as natural as the calluses on his palms. He'd fix a leaky gasket on a delivery van, coax life back into a sputtering sedan, align the wheels on an old man's pickup truck who'd been coming to him for 30 years. It was good, honest work. Necessary work. The kind of work that made the world turn even if nobody ever wrote songs about it. The money wasn't lavish, not by a long shot. Every month was a delicate dance between the utility bills, the mortgage, Lily's braces fund, Ethan's hockey equipment. There was always enough, just enough if you stretched it right, if you worked hard enough, if you never quite stopped moving. But sometimes, when the shop was quiet for a moment, perhaps between a customer leaving and the next one arriving, Beau would find his gaze drifting. Past the lifted cars, past the tools neatly hung on the pegboard, to a corner of the garage where an old tarp usually lay draped. Beneath it, hidden from the everyday grind, was his secret. A vintage flathead V8 engine, half restored, gleaming in places where he'd polished it, caked in dust in others where it had sat, neglected for weeks, sometimes months. This engine wasn't for a client. It was for him. A passion project, a dream of taking something old and forgotten, something with history and bringing it back to life better than new. He'd envisioned selling it, maybe even building a custom hot rod around it one day. A way to get ahead, to make a little extra, to give Sarah a break, to ensure Lily and Ethan didn't have to worry about whether there was enough. It was his escape, his ambition, his quiet yearning for something more than the daily grind. But it sat there, mostly. Started with gusto, with late nights fueled by ambition and the scent of metal polish, only to be abandoned. He'd tell himself he was too tired, too busy, that the real work, the paid work, had to come first. The truth was, it was easy to put off. Nobody was waiting on him for that engine. There was no client breathing down his neck, no deadline staring him down, no urgent need. He'd pour all his methodical precision, all his unwavering commitment, into the tasks that had an external audience, a tangible reward, a necessity. Yet the sight of that engine, half-finished, was a dull ache, a constant reminder of the gap between the dependable, gruff mechanic everyone saw and the man inside who yearned for more, who wanted to create something purely his own. He was good, he knew that. He could fix anything. But could he build something from nothing? Could he follow through on a dream that only he believed in? A deep-seated fear of stagnation gnawed at him. He saw other guys, younger, faster, coming up through the ranks, learning the new tech, the computer diagnostics. He was solid, reliable, but was he relevant? Was he growing? He looked at Sarah, still so vibrant, still dreaming of that little cottage by the lake they talked about sometimes. He looked at Lily, so full of potential, drawing intricate designs in her sketchbook, and Ethan, tackling every new challenge with fearless abandon. They deserved more than just enough. They deserved a father who wasn't just working hard, but working smart, working towards something. He'd feel a flush of shame whenever he considered the engine. It wasn't just a project. It was a symbol of his self-doubt, his tendency to prioritize everyone else's needs and problems over his own quiet aspirations. He'd start to imagine asking for help, maybe getting a younger apprentice to lend a hand, but then that stubborn resistance would rise. No, this was his. He had to do it. He just had to find the time. But time, he realized with a sigh that often went unheard even by himself, wasn't the problem. It was the will to show up when no one else was watching, when the only person he was letting down was himself. And somehow, that was the easiest person to let down of all. The smell of fried chicken and a hint of something sweet, Sarah's apple pie, probably usually welcomed Bo home from the garage. Tonight, though, the usual comfort felt hollow. He'd barely kicked off his work boots before he heard it, a frustrated sigh from Lily's room, followed by the distinctive sound of paper being crumpled. He walked past her open door, catching a glimpse of her hunched over her desk, long hair falling over her face. Around her, a colorful chaos of sketches, paints, and brushes. Lily lived in a world of vibrant imagination, constantly creating. He remembered the elaborate cityscape she'd been working on for weeks, a sprawling watercolor filled with impossible buildings and flying contraptions. It was beautiful, truly. But lately it seemed to gather dust more than paint. "Everything all right, kiddo?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe, trying for casual. Lily jumped, startled, then slowly turned. Her eyes, usually bright with creative fire, were clouded. She held up a half-finished drawing, a striking piece with intricate gears and a fantastical airship, but the background was a hesitant, smudged mess. I don't know, Dad," she mumbled, her voice tight with disappointment. I spent all this time on it, but it's not right. And nobody's going to see it anyway. Not until it's perfect. What's the point if nobody's going to see it until it's perfect?" She let the drawing fall onto the desk, landing face down among the other discarded attempts. The words hung in the air, heavier than any wrench Bo had ever lifted. What's the point if nobody's going to see it until it's perfect? It was like a spotlight had suddenly glared into the darkest corner of his own garage, illuminating the dust-covered engine block, the scattered tools, the half-finished plans. He saw himself in her words. He heard his own excuses echoing back from his daughter's mouth. He pictured that engine sitting there. He started with such fire, stripping down the components, carefully cataloging each part. But then a particularly tricky bolt, a missing specialty tool, a long day at the shop, and he'd leave it. For a day, then two, then a week. No one's waiting on this, Bo. No one's counting on you to finish this one. He told himself that. And now Lily, his bright, creative daughter, was telling herself the same damn thing. He wasn't just delaying his own dreams. He was unintentionally laying the groundwork for hers to falter, too. The truth hit him with the force of a piston going through the block. He was modeling this exact, debilitating perfectionism and self-sabotage. His quiet ambition wasn't just quiet. It was almost silent, suffocated by the very notion that it only mattered if it was perfect or seen. It was a betrayal of his own potential, and now, seeing it reflected in Lily, a betrayal of hers too. The taste in his mouth was bitter, like old engine oil. Sleep didn't come for Bo that night. Not even the heavy lull of a full stomach and Sarah's soft breathing beside him could coax it. He lay there, staring up at the popcorn ceiling, listening to the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The house was quiet, the kind of deep, enveloping quiet that only descends after everyone else has surrendered to slumber. It was the kind of quiet that allowed thoughts to grow enormous, menacing. Lily's words ricocheted in his skull. What's the point if nobody's going to see it until it's perfect? He wanted to tell her, no, honey, that's not right. You work for you. You work because the craft demands it, because the vision calls you. But the words had died in his throat. How could he say that to her when his own garage held the damning evidence of his hypocrisy? He slid out of bed, careful not to disturb Sarah, whose hand lay gently across his pillow. The floorboards creaked softly under his bare feet as he padded down the hall, past Lily's silent room, past Ethan's room where he could hear the faint, steady breathing of his youngest. He didn't stop in the kitchen for a glass of water. He just kept going, straight to the garage door. The air in the garage was cool, heavy with the scent of grease, old wood, and the faint, metallic tang of the vintage engine. He flicked on the single overhead bulb, casting long, distorted shadows around the cramped space. And there it was, the Ford Flathead, circa 53, sitting on its stand, half-assembled, half-stripped, covered in a fine layer of dust. A monument to good intentions and bad follow-through. He walked over to it, tracing a finger through the dust on the valve cover. He remembered the day he'd dragged it home, the excitement, the plans he'd spun for Sarah over dinner, how he'd restore it, how he'd sell it, maybe even get enough for that new furnace or a down payment on Lily's first car. The initial enthusiasm had been so potent, so real. But then the real work began. The meticulous cleaning, the frustrating hunt for parts, the hours alone, hunched over, covered in grime. And when the initial rush faded, so too did his motivation. He looked around the garage. A workbench piled with half-sorted bolts and obscure tools. A dusty schematic tacked to the wall, its corners curling. This wasn't just a neglected project. It was a physical manifestation of his fear of failure, his avoidance of the lonely, unseen grind. He was good at the doing, the moment-to-moment problem-solving. But the sustained, self-driven pursuit of something that wasn't a paid job, that didn't have an immediate deadline, that was where he faltered. A profound weariness settled over him, deeper than any physical exhaustion from a long day at the shop. This was a soul weariness, a quiet despair born of self-recognition. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was a husband, a father. And what was he teaching his kids? That dreams were fine to start, but easily abandoned if the path got tough and no one was watching. That the effort only counted if it was for someone else, for a paycheck, for a visible reward. He slumped onto an overturned oil drum, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. The garage light hummed, casting a pale, unforgiving glow on his calloused hands, the hands that could fix anything but seemed incapable of fixing this deep-seated habit of letting himself off the hook. He saw the years ahead, more of the same, just keeping the lights on, never quite reaching for that little extra, that personal victory. Was this what his life had become? A dependable, competent, yet ultimately unfulfilled routine. The brutal honesty of the 3 a.m. silence was deafening. He hadn't just stalled on an engine, he'd stalled on a part of himself. And it hurt. It hurt worse than any slipped wrench or bruised knuckle ever had. He was a man who prided himself on solving problems, on getting things running again. But here, in the quiet, merciless glare of the garage light, the problem was him, and he had no idea how to turn the key. He sat there, the silence a heavy weight. No explosion of anger, no sudden revelation. Just a slow, grinding realization, like old gears seizing up. This isn't working. Not just the stalled engine, but the stalling on himself, on the man he was becoming, defined by what he did for others, not what he built for himself. The quiet enough wasn't a roar, but a whisper that cut through the noise of his excuses. Enough. Enough of someday. Enough of more time. Enough of the fear that if he committed, truly poured his heart into something for himself, he might still fail, and that failure would feel twice as bitter. No grand blueprint for change lay on his workbench. No clear path to success, no guaranteed outcome. All he knew with a certainty that chilled him was that his current path, quiet abandonment of his own deepest aspirations, was no longer an option. It was eating at him, making him less vibrant, less present for his family. He couldn't continue waking up knowing his own engine was rusting, abandoned in the dark corners of his garage and his soul. The next evening, the smell of grease and faint exhaust still clinging to his work clothes, Bo walked past the inviting glow of the living room television. Lily was engrossed in a video, Ethan was attempting to build a precarious tower of blocks, and Sarah was humming softly in the kitchen. For a moment the old pull was there, the comfortable inertia of settling in, a beer in hand, letting the day's weariness seep into the couch cushions. But the whisper of enough from the previous night resonated with a new, quiet authority. He didn't make a big show of it, didn't announce his intentions to anyone. That was part of the old trap, the need for an audience to validate the effort. Instead, he simply turned right at the hallway, past the kitchen, and pushed open the heavy garage door. Air inside was cool still, carrying the faint, metallic scent of forgotten projects. The vintage engine sat there, a silent challenge under the single bare bulb he always forgot to replace with something brighter. Its block was dull with dust, wires tangled like dormant snakes. He picked up a rag, just a rag, and he started wiping. Not because he knew exactly where to start with the rebuild, but because it was something. It was an act of acknowledging its presence, his commitment. 10 minutes turned into 20, then 30. He wasn't wrenching, wasn't diagnosing. He was just cleaning, feeling the smooth, cold metal beneath his fingers, visualizing the polished gleam it once had, the roar it could make again. When Sarah called him for dinner, he walked back inside, not feeling invigorated, but with a different kind of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't a triumphant fist pump, more like a barely perceptible sigh of relief. He had shown up. Day 3 was harder. The sheen of novelty had already begun to dull. A particularly stubborn lug nut on a customer's pickup had eaten up an extra hour at the shop, leaving his shoulders knotted and his temper thin. He came home to a frantic Ethan who couldn't find his favorite toy car, and Lily, deep in the throes of teenage angst, slammed her bedroom door shut. Sarah greeted him with a sympathetic but tired smile, a silent acknowledgement of the never-ending domestic dance. The garage tonight felt less like a sanctuary and more like another obligation. The couch, a beacon of soft surrender, beckoned him. "Just 20 minutes," the voice in his head argued. "You're beat. You'll be more effective tomorrow." It was the same insidious siren song he'd heard countless times before, the one that led to weeks, then months of neglected dreams. He stood by the doorway to the living room, one hand still on his belt buckle, the other reaching for the remote. Then he thought of Lily, her shoulders slumped, muttering about her forgotten art project. What's the point if nobody's going to see it until it's perfect? He saw himself in that defeated posture, heard his own unspoken excuses. Perfection wasn't the point. Process was the point. Showing up, even when it felt pointless, that was the point. He walked past the remote, past the couch, and into the garage. He didn't feel like it. Not one bit. His hands were heavy, his mind foggy. He pulled out a box of old bolts he'd stripped from the engine and started sorting them by size and type, a mindless, methodical task. It was tedious, unglamorous. There was no grand vision in organizing rusty hardware. But he was doing something. He wasn't letting the inertia win. When the timer on his phone, which he'd set for 45 minutes, finally chirped, he wiped his hands and felt a different kind of tired. Not the bone-deep exhaustion of giving up, but the honest ache of having fought a quiet battle and won, just for tonight. A week in, the invisible cracks began to show. Beau woke up one Tuesday with a nasty crick in his neck and a dull throb behind his eyes. He'd spent an hour past closing at the shop, chasing down a wiring fault in an old Ford, and had barely gotten his 45 minutes in the garage before collapsing into bed. This morning, the 5 a.m. alarm felt like a personal insult. At work, he felt sluggish, making a simple mistake on an oil change that cost him an extra half hour of correction. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the thought of the garage felt like a lead weight in his stomach. "I just can't tonight," he told himself, parking his work truck. "I'll double up tomorrow." He said it 100 times over the years. This time, it tasted like ash in his mouth. He went inside, ate dinner with his family, half listening to Lily describe a drama at school and Ethan drone on about a new video game. He even played a quick round of checkers with Ethan, letting the boy win. He felt hollow. The absence of his garage time, even the grinding, unfun parts left a void. He tried to ignore it, poured himself a glass of water, sat on the couch. But the engine was there, a ghost in his periphery. It wasn't about the engine anymore, not really. It was about him, about the commitment he'd made to himself, to that quiet, desperate need for change that had surfaced at 3 a.m. He felt the familiar creep of self-loathing, the disappointment that whispered, "See, you're still the same. You always give up on your own stuff." At 9:30 p.m., Sarah found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a page from an engine manual he'd pulled out. "Everything all right, Beau?" she asked, her voice soft. Up a flicker of something unreadable in his tired eyes. "Yeah," he said too quickly, "just thinking." She didn't press, she just nodded and went to finish up in the living room, but the question hung in the air. Everything all right? No, it wasn't. Not when he let himself off the hook, he sighed, pushing away from the table. The silence of the house had settled, the kids long since asleep. He walked back to the garage, the cold night air a sharp slap to his face. He didn't turn on the main light, just the small work lamp over the engine. In the dim glow, the cast iron looked almost alive, a silent testament to countless hours of unseen labor, whether by him or the engineers who designed it decades ago. He didn't have a plan, just his hands. He picked up a wrench, a wire brush. He started scraping away rust from a small bracket, a painstaking, repetitive motion. The rust flakes flew, tiny orange specks in the single beam of light. He worked for an hour, maybe more, his back aching, his neck stiff, but a different kind of peace settling over him. It wasn't the peace of relaxation, but the hard-won peace of integrity. He hadn't doubled up on anything. He hadn't magically caught up. He just showed up late, tired, and without fanfare. He'd kept his quiet promise to himself. By the end of the second week, the battle hadn't ceased, but it had subtly shifted. The enemy wasn't just procrastination. It was the quiet despair that whispered, "What's the point?" He found himself staring at the complex wiring diagrams, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the task. He still had days where he wanted to collapse on the couch, where the garage felt like a burden. There were evenings where he'd just sit on his stool for 20 minutes, staring at the engine, not touching a thing, just forcing himself to be present. One Saturday morning, usually reserved for errands or helping Sarah with yard work, he found himself drawn to the garage. Lily poked her head in, a rare visit. "What you doing, Dad?" she asked, curiosity replacing her usual teenaged aloofness. He was meticulously cleaning out a carburetor, small parts laid out on a sheet of newspaper, soaking in solvent. "Just getting this old girl breathing again," he mumbled, not looking up. Lily watched him for a minute, then said, "Looks really complicated." "It is," Bo admitted, "but it's a lot of small parts all gotta work together." He paused, then looked at her. "Like life, I guess, or art projects. One step at a time, even when nobody's watching." He hadn't meant for the words to come out, but they did, a small, unexpected connection. He noticed the change, not in some grand transformation, but in the small victories. The days he went to the garage simply because it was time, not because he felt motivated. The evenings he pushed through the drudgery of cleaning parts or deciphering a faded diagram, not for praise, but for the quiet satisfaction of incremental progress. He wasn't skipping days anymore. He was showing up. It was ugly, inconsistent in quality, sometimes just barely making it, but he was there. The engine wasn't close to being done, but it was cleaner, more organized, and Bo was starting to see the scattered pieces as a potential whole again. And in that, he found a stubborn, quiet strength he hadn't known he still possessed. The garage became Bo's sanctuary, but not in the way it used to be, a place to hide from the day, a place where dreams went to gather dust. Now it was a forge. He was in there every evening, every spare hour, the rhythmic clink of wrenches, the low hum of a polishing wheel, the faint scent of oil and metal drifting through the open door. It wasn't always a symphony. Sometimes it was the gritting of teeth, the frustrated grunt of a bolt refusing to budge, the quiet despair of a part he couldn't find. But he kept showing up. Sarah noticed it first. Not just his presence in the garage, but the way he carried himself. His shoulders seemed to relax a fraction, the permanent furrow between his brows softened. One Tuesday, she brought him a thermos of coffee, leaning against the doorframe. "You're out here a lot," she observed, her voice gentle, not critical. Bo looked up from meticulously sanding down a rusted intake manifold. His hands were black with grime, but his eyes, tired as they still were, held a different glint. "It's coming along," said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Funny, thought I'd be sick of it by now, but seeing it take shape even like this." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the scattered components. "It's something." Sarah just smiled, a small, knowing smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She knew. She'd always known the Bo who dreamed, the Bo who saw potential in discarded things. He was coming back. Ethan, ever the curious one, started to hang around more often. He wouldn't offer to help. Bo had an almost religious aversion to others touching his precision work, but he'd watch, fascinated, as Bo painstakingly rebuilt the carburetor, tiny springs and gaskets laid out with surgeon-like care. "Dad," Ethan asked one evening, "why do you spend so long on the inside parts? No one's ever gonna see them." Bo paused, holding a minuscule jet in a pair of tweezers. He looked at his son, then back at the engine. "Because, son," he said slowly, "the outside's just for show. It's the inside that makes it run. If the inside ain't right, the outside don't matter a damn bit." It was a simple truth, spoken without grandeur, but it hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Even Lily, the queen of indifference, found herself drawn in. Not to the grease or the engine parts, but to the change in her father. She'd catch him humming under his breath as he worked, something he hadn't done in years. She saw the satisfaction on his face when a particularly stubborn piece finally clicked into place. She saw him not just doing work, but engaged in it. One afternoon, finding him sketching out a custom exhaust manifold design, she sat down on an old stool. "Dad," she began, a hint of vulnerability in her voice, "remember that art project I was talking about? The one I almost gave up on?" Bo nodded, a pencil still held to his chin. "I started working on it again," she admitted, looking at her hands. "Just little bits when no one's around. It's still not perfect, but it's getting there, and I actually kind of like it now." A warmth spread through Bo's chest, a quiet triumph that resonated deeper than any completed engine ever could. He just nodded again, a small, proud smile touching his lips. He didn't need to say anything. The connection, the lesson, had found its way. Weeks bled into months. The old engine, once a dusty hulk, was now a masterpiece of polished chrome, custom-painted block, and meticulously restored parts. Every bolt, every wire, every gasket had been handled by Bo. He knew every curve, every imperfection, every story etched into its metal. He'd learned to weld, to meticulously blend paint, to troubleshoot electrical systems that had baffled him for decades. The process had been grueling, often thankless, mostly solitary. But in those quiet, unobserved hours, something remarkable had happened. One Saturday morning, the air crisp and clear, Bo finally wheeled the completed engine out into the driveway. It gleamed in the sunlight, a testament to countless evenings, scraped knuckles, and unwavering resolve. Sarah, Lily, and Ethan gathered around it, their faces a mixture of awe and pride. "Dad," Ethan whispered, running a reverent finger over a polished chrome valve cover. "It's beautiful." Lily, usually so stoic, simply leaned against him, a rare, soft gesture. "You really did it, Dad." Bo looked at them, then at the engine. He didn't feel exhaustion anymore, just a deep, abiding satisfaction. The engine itself was impressive, yes, but what he saw in its reflection was the man who had built it. A man who had found his way back to himself, not through grand gestures, but through a million tiny, unseen commitments. He ended up selling the engine to a collector in another state, a fair price that eased some of the financial burden and funded a few long-postponed house repairs. But the real treasure wasn't the money. The real treasure was what he had built inside himself. Bo still worked with his hands, still carried the quiet weariness of physical labor. But the way he looked at things had changed. He saw not just the broken parts, but the process of restoration. He saw not just the grind, but the growth. His garage wasn't just a place for projects anymore. It was a testament. Sometimes, late at night, after everyone else was asleep, Bo would wander back into the garage. He'd stand there, hands in his pockets, looking at the empty spot where the engine used to be. It was quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator. He used to think work was just for the clock, for the paycheck, for when someone was watching, counting the minutes. But the real stuff, the stuff that builds you, happens when the lights are low and nobody's watching. That's when you find out what you're really made of.